In the spring of 1998, a man named Dale Crum drove his university extension truck up the gravel lane of the Hargrove place in Cass County, Nebraska, stepped out in clean boots that had never touched that particular ground, and told Vera Hargrove that she had two options. She could sell the operation now before the debt compounded further, or she could watch it taken from her one missed payment at a time. He set a folder on the hood of his truck. He called it a projection. He said he had seen this situation before. He said he was genuinely sorry. She handed the folder back without opening it. 17 years later, in the summer of 2015, Vera Hargrove signed papers on 480 acres that had once belonged to Dale Crum's brother-in-law, a man who had bought on leverage in 2007 and could not survive what came after. The sale price was $2,340 an acre, paid in full. Vera did not borrow a dollar to close it. That is the story we need to tell, not the transaction at the end, which tells you nothing, but the 17 years in between, which tells you everything about what a piece of Nebraska ground will teach a person who stays long enough to learn it, and what it cannot teach a person who arrives with a folder already filled. Dale Crum was not a bad man. That needs to be said plainly, and said first, because the story only works if you understand it. He had a master's degree in agricultural economics from the University of Nebraska. He had spent 11 years advising farm operations across 4 counties, and he was right far more often than he was wrong. He could read a balance sheet the way some people read weather, and what he read on the Hargrove balance sheet in the spring of 1998 was a widow, 53 years old, carrying $640,000 in operating debt on a beef operation that had just lost its operator and running 800 acres of ground she had never managed alone. He was reading the paper correctly. He simply could not read the ground. Vera had come to this land at 22, a railroad man's daughter from Plattsmouth who knew more about ledgers than livestock. She had learned the Hargrove ground the way her husband Roy taught her to learn it, in sections, in seasons, one pasture at a time. Roy had grown up on that ground. His father had broken the first 40 acres of it in 1927, and Roy had been raised knowing that the soil in the North Quarter drained differently from the South, that the creek bottom would hold a full week more moisture than the upland after a dry July, that the cattle who wintered on the native grass in the east pasture arrived at spring in a different condition than cattle wintered on supplement and hay. These were not beliefs Roy held. They were observations Roy had made and written down. He kept a journal. He had kept one since his father handed the first volume to him in 1961, and by the time he died of a heart attack in November of 1997, there were 9 of them, filled in 2 different hands. Vera found the 10th volume, the blank one Roy had bought, but never opened, in the desk drawer beside the others. She opened it herself. Let me tell you about what she found in those 9 journals, because it is the actual story, the one Dale Crum could not read from the projection in his folder. Roy had tracked, for 36 years, the body condition scores of every cow in the herd at 3 points in the season: weaning, the start of winter, and calving. He had tracked, alongside those scores, exactly what each pasture had been grazed, for how long, and in what season. He had recorded rainfall by week from a rain gauge he built himself, and mounted on a post at the farm gate. He had tracked the weaning weights of calves by dam and by sire, back 4 generations. And running through all 9 volumes like a thread, in Roy's cramped handwriting and then increasingly in Vera's beside his, was a set of grazing decisions that looked, on paper, Like inefficiency, Roy did not graze his pastures evenly. He rested some of them entirely for a full season, sometimes two. He moved cattle in groups through the native grass in the creek bottom in tight rotations, concentrating them for short bursts and then pulling them off entirely. He refused to plant any of the native ground corn or milo, even in the years when the commodity price made it the obvious financial choice. Dale Crum, when he was told this, called it sentimental. He said it at the Cass County Cattlemen's meeting in March of 1999, the meeting where he stood in front of a room of 40 ranchers and said, quietly and with genuine concern in his voice, that the Hargrove operation was what happened when inherited sentiment was allowed to substitute for agricultural science. Vera was in the room. She sat in the third row. She said nothing. She had by then been running the operation alone for 16 months. The first calving season had gone through March and April of 1998, and she had pulled 3 calves without help. 2 had lived. She did not think of that as a good or bad percentage. It was what the season had given. She had moved the spring pairs through the creek bottom pasture in May the way Roy's journal said to move them, 48 hours in the south section, and then the gate opened to the north section, and she had watched the grass recover behind them in the particular way it recovered when the root system was intact, the stems standing back up within a week, the ungrazed plants filling in across the disturbed ground where the hooves had broken the soil cap. She had seen Roy describe exactly this in the 4th Journal, Volume 4, the entry dated May 14th, 1978, where he had written in his cramped hand that the grass, after a short burst of heavy grazing, came back faster than the same grass after a long, slow graze, and that he believed this was because the short burst mimicked what a moving bison herd had done to that same prairie for 10,000 years before the homesteaders arrived. Roy had no degree. He had read one book about bison grazing ecology, borrowed from the county library in 1974, and returned 9 months later with margin notes. He had spent the rest of his working life testing what that book proposed against what the land was telling him, and he had written down what the land said. Vera read every entry. It took her the winter of 1997 and part of the spring of 1998 to get through all 9 volumes. Some nights she sat at the kitchen table under the hanging light until past midnight, reading with one finger following the lines of Roy's handwriting, turning pages carefully because some of the early volumes were fragile at the spine. She read about the drought of 1983 when Roy had pulled the cattle off the east quarter 2 weeks earlier than he wanted to because the soil moisture in the creek gauge was running low, and how the east quarter had come back green by September, while the neighbor's continuous graze pasture to the north had stayed bare into October. She read the entry from July 1989 where he had pushed a soil probe into the creek bottom and found the grass roots running to 19 inches, and had written beside the measurement in capital letters, "Do not plow this." She read the entry from 1991, the wet year, where he had stocked the rested quarters at double the normal rate for a short window, and the grass had absorbed it without damage, the soil holding the excess moisture, and the herd finishing the season in the best body condition Roy had ever recorded. She understood, by the time she finished the 9th volume, that what she had inherited was not 800 acres of Nebraska ground. It was 800 acres of ground that had been listened to for 36 years, and the record of what it had said. What Roy had been doing, and what Vera continued after she opened the 10th Journal, was a form of planned grazing that old-time ranchers and a handful of Zimbabwean and South African researchers had been documenting since the 1950s, though Roy had arrived at it by observation rather than by reading. Let me tell you how it works, because the mechanism is the whole point. Grass in the mixed prairie ecosystem of the eastern Nebraska river bottom country does not grow like a crop. It grows in a pulse cycle, controlled by root depth, soil biology, and rainfall timing. When you graze a native grass pasture continuously, the cattle select the same plants they preferred on the first pass, biting them again before they can recover. And the root system of those plants shortens over years, reducing the pasture's capacity to hold water during dry periods and to hold its ground during heavy rain. The cattle grow up the easy forage and leave the less palatable plants ungrazed, and those plants crowd the grazed ones out over time. What you get, after 15 or 20 years, is a pasture that looks adequate in a wet year and fails in a dry one, and a soil profile that is losing organic matter quietly, invisibly, season by season. What Roy's rotation did was remove the cattle before the preferred plants were overstressed, let the full community of grasses recover together, and allow the root systems to reach deep enough to bank moisture. The concentrated hoof traffic in the short burst of grazing broke the soil cap and pressed seed into contact with the ground. The manure distribution improved. The soil biology ran deeper, and across 36 years, the native pastures on the Hargrove ground had been building something that showed up in no accounting column. The root mass was deep. The water-holding capacity was high. The North Quarter Creek bottom could carry cattle into August in a year that left the upland ground cracked and bare by the 4th of July. The soil biology piece is the one that takes the most explaining, and it is the piece that Dale Crum and Glenn Prater and every other person who looked at a balance sheet and saw a widow in over her head could not see from where they were standing. When a grass plant is grazed past the point of recovery, it pulls carbon back from its root system to fund the regrowth of its leaves. The roots shorten. Over years, a continuously grazed pasture has roots that run 4 or 5 inches deep rather than 14 or 20. Those shallow roots cannot reach the moisture that sits in the subsoil. In a drought year, a pasture with 5-inch roots dries out from the top down and goes bare. A pasture with 19-inch roots is still pulling moisture from a zone that has not yet given up its water. The grass stays alive, stressed but alive, and the soil beneath it, because it has not been exposed and crusted over, continues to absorb what little rain comes rather than shedding it as runoff. Roy had measured none of this with scientific instruments. He had no probe when he started, no soil lab he could afford to consult, no researcher in his corner. What he had was the observation that after a good rest, his east quarter held color longer into a dry August than his neighbor's ground did, and the patience to move the cattle before they took the color away. He had written in the 6th Journal that he did not know exactly why the rested pasture survived what the ungrazed pasture could not, but that the answer was probably in the ground below where a person could see it, and that his job was to keep the grass in a condition to find it. Vera kept the cattle moving in the same rotations Roy had used, and she improved on them. She added a second cross fence in the creek bottom in 1999, dividing the east section into 3 smaller cells that allowed her to move the pairs through on a tighter schedule and pull them off earlier, before the preferred plants showed any sign of bite stress. The temporary wire cost her $340 in materials and 2 days of work. It was the only infrastructure investment she made in her first 3 years. Everything else went to the debt. Roy had measured this. It was in the journals. Vera knew it because she had watched it happen beside him, and she knew it because she had written it down herself in the margins of volumes 6, 7, 8, The debt was real. Dale Crum had not invented that. Roy's last 3 years had included a drought in 1995, a crashed cattle market in 1996, and then Roy's illness in 1997, and the operation had borrowed to survive each one. The $640,000 was not a projection. It was a number sitting in a bank in Plattsmouth with an interest rate of 7.4%, and Vera's first year running the operation alone was going to be the year it tried to collect. Her neighbor to the west was a man named Carl Vogel. Carl was 58 in 1998, a second-generation farmer who had been watching the Hargrove place his whole adult life, and who, when Roy died, sat with Vera on the porch for 2 hours without saying much before he stood up and told her to call him if she needed a hand. Carl had taken the other path. He had bought a planter in 1994, added a 320-acre rental parcel in 1996, financed a new grain bin in 1997, and was running his ground hard and efficiently and profitably, he told Vera, as long as everything kept moving the way it was moving. He was not boasting. He was a careful man. He said that last part with the particular tone of a person who knows that as long as everything keeps moving is load-bearing language. Carl's operation looked the way a well-run modern grain and cattle operation was supposed to look. The equipment was new enough to be reliable and old enough not to be embarrassing. His pastures were even, and his hay ground was straight, and his calves weaned at consistent weights and sold in a consistent window. He had a line of credit at the Plattsmouth Bank that Dale Crum had helped him establish in 1993, and he serviced it on time every year, and he thought of it the way most farmers think of operating debt. The cost of doing business in a capital-intensive industry, neither alarming nor trivial, simply present. He watched Vera from across the fence line the way a neighbor watches a situation that concerns him, but that he has not been asked to comment on. He saw her pull calves alone in the March mud. He saw her move the pears through the creek bottom in the old way Roy had used, which Carl had never tried because Roy had never explained it to him in language that made it worth trying. He saw her leave the East Quarter empty all summer in 1999, the grass growing ungrazed and rank, and he understood that as either deliberate or a sign that she was having trouble managing the herd's movement. He was not sure which. Carl watched Vera's first calving season. He said nothing when she pulled a live calf at 2 a.m. by herself. He said nothing when she sold her calf crop in October at weights that were respectable but not exceptional. He said nothing when Dale Crum came back in November of 1998 and held another meeting in town and called the Hargrove operations management approach, without using her name, an anomaly rooted in non-scalable sentiment. What he did say, one evening in the spring of 1999 when Vera was pulling wire for a temporary cross fence in the creek bottom pasture, was, "What are you doing with that section, Vera?" She told him she was resting the East Quarter for the summer. Carl looked at the grass. He looked at it a long time. Then he said, "Roy used to do that too. I never understood it." That was as close as Carl came to asking a question. He went home. The following spring, he bought a self-propelled sprayer. The sprayer cost $94,000, financed at 6.8% over 7 years. Carl needed it for the herbicide passes on his corn ground, which he had expanded on the rental parcel, and the county extension recommendation was 2 passes per season on a field that size. He paid for the first pass in 2000 and the second in 2001, and found that his weed pressure was declining but not disappearing, and that the second pass was eliminating the competition, but also, he noticed, doing something to the soil in the rental parcel's low spots. something he did not have a word for, but that showed up as a crust after a heavy rain that had not been there 5 years earlier. He did not consult the journals. He did not have journals. He called Dale Crum, who recommended a different formulation for the low spots, and told Carl the crusting was manageable with an additional tillage pass. The tillage pass cost $18 an acre. Carl ran it on 80 acres of the rental parcel in the spring of 2001. The crust came back the following fall. If there was a second dismissal, the one that stung at a different pitch, it came in 2002 at a loan renewal meeting at the bank in Plattsmouth. The loan officer, a man named Glenn Prater, who had a degree from Creighton and 11 years behind that desk, reviewed Vera's operating statement for the fourth year in a row and said, in a voice that was careful not to be unkind, that her per-acre cost of production on the cow-calf operation continued to run significantly above the county average. He was, he said, going to need to talk to his supervisor about the renewal terms. He tapped his pen on the statement. He called her situation an ongoing concern. She asked him what the county average calving rate was. He checked his sheet. 87%. She told him her 5-year average was 94. He wrote that down. He renewed the loan. He did not apologize for the pen tapping, but the meeting was shorter after that. Glenn Prater was not wrong that her per-acre costs ran high. The Hargrove operation carried fixed costs that a grain operation did not because it was a cow-calf operation, which is a different animal entirely, and not only because livestock are animals and corn is a plant. A cow-calf operation produces a calf that is alive and has to be managed through to weaning. And the quality of that management shows up in the weaning weight. And the weaning weight is the number that determines whether you made money or went backwards. Vera's calves had been weaning heavier than the county average since her 3rd year, and the premium she was receiving at the October sale was not accidental. Her cows were in good body condition at calving because they had wintered on native grass in the creek bottom pastures that had been rested properly the season before, and because the native grass was higher in protein in late fall than the cool season grasses most operations were relying on, and because a cow that enters winter in good condition calves easier and produces more milk and weans a heavier calf. This is a chain of causation. Every link is visible if you look at the right thing. Glenn Prater was looking at per-acre cost, which is the right thing to look at when you are a bank, and cost is what you need to control for. He was not looking at the chain. The debt came down by $80,000 the first year, $95,000 the second, $110,000 the third. Vera was not running the operation with a different philosophy than Roy. She was running it with his philosophy and her own records layered on top. She had filled the 10th journal and started an 11th. She tracked the same things Roy had tracked. Body condition scores, pasture rotations, rainfall, weaning weights, and she added columns Roy had not thought to keep because he had not been trained to think in those terms. Columns for soil moisture by quadrant, noted from the creek gauge she installed in 1999, and columns for the price delta she was seeing at auction between her calves and the county average. Her calves were heavier at weaning, not by a little, by an average of 42 pounds per head over her first 5 years. At 40 cents a pound in a herd of 180 cows, that was roughly $3,000 per calf crop above what the county average would have produced. It did not sound like a rescue. It sounded, to most people who heard the number, like a respectable result in a difficult situation. That was how it sounded because the mechanism was invisible. If something you have known or suspected about a piece of ground has been confirmed or upended by what you are hearing, I'd be glad to hear about it. What Vera was doing is not unique to Nebraska. It is being done on ground all over the country by operators who have been watching their particular piece of land long enough to know what it is telling them, and it is being missed by every balance sheet that does not have a column for root depth. By 2004, Vera owed $190,000. The debt that had felt like a tide when Dale Crum set his folder on the truck hood was now a number she could see the bottom of. Carl Vogel had by then added a corn pivot on the south quarter of his rental parcel, financed at a rate that made good sense at 2003 corn prices. He had also, in the spring of 2003, called Vera to ask if she had noticed that the East Creek bottom pasture looked greener than his ground on the other side of the fence line. She had noticed. She told him what Roy had told her once, in the specific cadence Roy used when he wanted something to land. The grass does not know what year it is. It knows what you asked of it last season. Carl went home and thought about that for 3 years. Patch had been with Vera since the spring of 2003, a blue heeler pup that Roy's cousin had brought by, saying the dog needed a place with the room to work. Vera had not planned to take on a dog in her 6th year of running the place alone. The pup sat in the truck cab on the way home and put his chin on her knee, and she drove the rest of the way without moving her hand from the wheel. That was settled. Patch spent the following years moving cattle at her signal, sitting beside her truck in the mornings while she walked the fence lines, and sleeping on the porch mat outside the kitchen door. He was one of those dogs that communicate through position rather than sound. Where he sat in a pasture told Vera something about where the cattle were moving, and she learned to read him the way Roy had learned to read the grass. Patch was at the creek gate with her in the spring and the fall and in the summers when the pairs were moving, and he was on the porch when she came in at dark, and in 17 years he missed almost none of it. By 2004, Vera owed $190,000. The debt that had felt like a tide when Dale Crum set his folder on the truck hood was now a number she could see the bottom of. Carl Vogel had by then added a corn pivot on the south quarter of his rental parcel, financed at a rate that made good sense at 2003 corn prices. He had also, in the spring of 2003, called Vera to ask if she had noticed that the East Creek bottom pasture looked greener than his ground on the other side of the fence line. She had noticed. She told him what Roy had told her once in the specific cadence Roy used when he wanted something to land. The grass does not know what year it is. It knows what you asked of it last season. Carl went home and thought about that for 3 years. Then came 2012. And 2012 did not care what anyone thought. The drought that broke across the central Great Plains in the summer of 2012 was the worst since 1956 in Cass County. It came on hard in June and did not relent until October. The United States Department of Agriculture would later classify it as the largest drought disaster on record to that point. Corn that had been knee-high in May was gone or stunted by July. Pastures that had been carrying the county average stocking rate went off in August, the grass burning back to bare ground, the soil sealing into a crust that shed what little rain came rather than absorbing it. Vera had watched the soil moisture readings in her creek gauge through June. By June 20th, the gauge was showing readings below the threshold Roy had noted in the 1983 journal as the point at which the creek bottom pasture needed to be rested immediately, or the root mass would be damaged. She had moved the pairs off the east quarter on June 23rd, 2 months ahead of schedule, and put them on the upland ground with supplemental hay she had put up in May from the meadow on the north side of the property. The hay was costing her, in feed cost and in management time, more than she had planned to spend in the summer quarter. She did it anyway. The journal said to do it. July brought no relief. The soil in the upland ground dried to powder by the second week of the month, and the corn in the fields east of the county road went from stressed to failed in a window of about 10 days. Vera drove to Plattsmouth on July 18th to buy 2 additional tons of supplement for the cows she had pulled from the creek bottom, and she passed 4 fields on the way that were already brown to the horizon, the leaves curled and papery, the stalks too dry to hold moisture. She had not planted corn. She had for 20 years held the decision Roy had made. The Hargrove ground stayed in native grass and in pasture. She had been told repeatedly and in various registers that this decision was the reason her operation ran at a higher per-acre cost than the neighbors. She drove past the failing cornfields and said nothing, because there was no one to say it to. Carl's corn pivot on the south quarter failed by July 15th. He lost 80% of that crop. His pasture ground, which he had grazed continuously at the conventional stocking rate recommended by the county extension, went bare by the 1st of August. He had to sell 60 head of bred cows at a distressed market that summer, 40 cents below what he would have gotten in October, to avoid overgrazing ground that could not carry them. The loss on those cows alone was $38,000. The pivot repair and the crop loss combined to push him into a conversation with the bank in August that he had not expected to have until he was much older. The county average cow-calf operation in Cass County lost 34 head per 100 through forced liquidation that summer. Vera lost none. The creek bottom pasture, pulled from grazing in June before the roots had been stressed, held its moisture 2 inches down through the whole of August, and the cattle she brought back to it in September found grass that was short but standing and soil that was not sealed. Dale Crum, who by 2012 was the district extension supervisor, visited 14 operations in Cass County that summer to assess drought impact. He drove up the Hargrove Lane in the first week of August with a clipboard and a form and the particular efficiency of a man who has 14 more stops to make before dark. Vera walked him to the creek bottom pasture. The native grass in the east quarter was short. That was true. It was not lush. It had not been a wet year. The cattle were grazing it but lightly, and the ground beneath was not bare. It was not sealed. You could push a boot toe into it and find moisture 2 inches down in ground that had received no more rain than the ground across the fence, where Carl's pasture had gone to dust. The root mass running under that native grass was deep enough and dense enough that the soil held what little rain had come rather than losing it to runoff. Dale Crum walked across it for 5 minutes. He pulled a handful of grass and looked at the roots. He had a probe in his truck, and he came back with it and pushed it into the ground. He checked the reading. He looked at the fence line and at Carl's ground on the other side and back at the reading. He said, "How deep is this grass rooted?" Vera said, "My husband's journals say the north quarter was running about 14 inches of effective root depth in 1989 when he measured it. I measured this section in April. It was running 19. Dale Crum looked at the probe reading again. He was quiet for a long time. He was not, in that moment, filling in a form. He was standing in the particular silence of a person whose model has just told him something he cannot explain. He said, "You'd be willing to show me those journals?" She said yes. He came back in September when the drought had moved through and the fall rains had started. He sat at the kitchen table where Roy's journals were stacked in the order they had been kept. He read for 2 hours. He asked questions. They were not the questions of a man gathering information for a report. They were the questions of a man who has carried a settled belief for 14 years and has just found the first evidence that the belief was incomplete. Before he left, he said without preamble that he owed her an apology for the 1999 meeting. He said it the way people say hard things when they have thought about how to say them. Then he asked if she would be willing to come to the county extension office in the spring to talk about what she had been measuring. She said she would think about it. By the autumn of 2013, Denny Vogel was in his junior year at the University of Nebraska, studying agronomy on a path Carl had encouraged since Denny was 15. And he came home for the harvest break and walked the fence line with his father the way he had done since childhood. Carl had told him that summer about the Hargrove Creek bottom and about what Dale Crum had seen there with the probe. Denny listened with the careful skepticism of a 21-year-old who has been educated in one direction and is hearing evidence pointing in another. He asked Carl if Mrs. Hargrove's pasture really looked that different from the neighbor's ground. Carl said he should come see it himself. They walked the fence line on a November afternoon when the grass was dormant, and the difference was, if anything, more visible than it was in a growing season. Because the native grass in the creek bottom stood in a tawny mat that was intact and dense, while Carl's continuous grazed pasture on the other side showed patches of bare ground and a thin turf that had not recovered fully even in the cooler temperatures of fall. Denny said nothing for a while. He pushed the toe of his boot into the soil on Vera's side and then walked across the fence and pushed his boot into Carl's side. The difference in the feel underfoot was the difference between pushing into firm, water-holding ground and pushing into something that had begun to compact. He was a junior in agronomy, and he had not been taught to feel for that. He had been taught to measure it, which was the right way, and which he intended to do when he had a probe in his hand. He told his father he wanted to come back and take core samples. Carl said he thought Mrs. Hargrove would let him. Denny knocked on Vera's door that November and introduced himself. She had known him since he was 7, but she let him introduce himself properly because he was doing it properly, hat in hand, explaining what he was studying and what he hoped to learn. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, and she showed him the 11th journal and some of the earlier volumes. He read slowly, turning pages without speaking. He asked her at one point how Roy had arrived at the rotation schedule he used in the 1970s, before there was published research to support it, and she told him about the library book and the margin notes and the observation that had started it all, that the rested pasture held color longer in a dry August. Denny said quietly, "That's basically what the savory grazing research confirmed in 1988. Vera said she didn't know that. Roy hadn't known it either. Denny looked at the journal for another long moment. Then he said, "He figured it out by watching." She said yes. That was how Roy had done most things. The single number that settled the argument was not dramatic in its arrival. It was read aloud at a meeting at the county extension office in October of 2014, with 11 people present. Carl Vogel was not there, but 2 of his neighbors were. Dale Crum was there. He had called the meeting. The number was a soil organic matter percentage, taken by an independent laboratory from core samples, pulled in 3 locations across the Hargrove Creek bottom pasture. It was the number that a soil scientist named Ruth Halloway, who had driven down from Lincoln at Dale Crum's request after he sent her photographs of the journals, had asked to see before she would commit to an opinion. The county average soil organic matter in Cass County native pasture, which Ruth Halloway had measured for a regional project 2 years prior, was 3.1%. The Hargrove Creek bottom came in at 6.8%. Ruth Holloway held the lab report for a moment after she read it. She set it on the table. She said, in a voice that carried no drama because she did not need any, "This ground is worth more per acre than any parcel I have tested in this part of Nebraska in the past decade." She said the number she had in mind. It was $4,100 per acre. That number did not land on the room gently. It landed the way a single specific number lands when it contradicts 14 years of received wisdom in a single sentence. The room was quiet for a long time. Vera did not say anything. She had known, in the way you know things you have been measuring for years, that the ground was in better condition than the day Roy died. She had not known it was worth that. The number sat there, and she let it sit. Dale Crum sat very still. He had sponsored the testing. He had read the journals. He was not surprised exactly. He was absorbing the distance between the model he had carried for 30 years and the number he had just heard read aloud in a room in Plattsmouth. He looked at the lab report for a moment, then at Vera and said, "I owe you an apology. I said something about your operation at a public meeting in 1999 that I should not have said. I was wrong about what I was looking at." Vera said she appreciated that. She did not sell. She did not take Ruth Holloway's appraisal to a lender and borrow against it. She folded it into the 11th Journal and closed the cover. What she did instead, in the spring of 2015, was buy the Crum parcel. Not Dale Crum's. His brother-in-law's, a man named Stover, who had bought 480 acres on a leverage arrangement in 2007 that made sense at 2007 land prices and had been unwinding since. The sale price was $2,340 an acre, which was not a bargain and was not meant to be. Vera paid cash. She had been paying cash for 6 years by then, since the last of Roy's debt came off the books in 2009, and the $640,000 that Dale Crum had itemized on his projection had been replaced over the following 10 years by a checking account balance that she did not discuss with anyone. The first thing she did with the Stover ground was rest it. All 480 acres, the full first season, no grazing, not a head of cattle. Carl Vogel stood at the fence line in June of that year and looked at the resting pasture and said, "Roy used to do that." Vera said yes. Carl said, "I should have asked him more questions." She said, "You can come over in the fall and I'll show you what he measured." Carl came over. He brought his son, Denny, who had graduated from Nebraska that May with a degree in agronomy and who had been telling his father since January that the continuous grazing strategy needed to be reconsidered. Denny sat at the kitchen table across from his father and across from Vera and looked at the 11 journals stacked in their order. He was 23 years old and had just spent 4 years being told what the science said, and he was now looking at 38 years of original observation that the science had taken 50 years to catch up to. He turned the pages carefully. He said, "You collected this yourself?" Vera said that she and Roy had. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if she would be willing to let him photograph the measurement pages. She said yes. She said Roy would have liked someone with a degree looking at them. Dale Crum came to the spring extension meeting in 2016, the one where Vera spoke for the first time about the management approach she had kept across 38 years of journals. He sat in the second row. He had helped organize the meeting. He had written a short introduction for her that he read from a card before she stood up. And the introduction said, among other things, that the work on the Hargrove ground was among the most sustained examples of observational soil management in the county extension's record. He did not call it a hobby. He did not call it sentimental. He called it science conducted in the field across 4 decades by a woman who paid better attention than most of the people who had been paid to pay attention. After the meeting, 3 of the families in the room asked Vera if she would be willing to walk their ground and talk about what she was looking for when she walked it. She said she would, in the fall, once calving was behind her. 12 families came that autumn, walking the creek bottom in groups of 3 and 4, while Vera showed them what the root depth meant, and what the soil cap meant, and what a pasture that had been properly rested looked like against one that had not. She charged nothing for it. She asked only that they start their own journals and bring them back in 3 years. Denny Vogel brought a soil probe and took core samples that afternoon, jotting notes in a small book his father had bought him. He had gone to work for the State Extension Service by then. He used what he found on the Hargrove ground as the basis of a management bulletin he wrote the following winter, and the bulletin cited Roy's journals by name. Vera gave the 12th journal, the one she had started after finishing the 11th, to Denny on the day he came to pick up the photocopies he had asked for. She told him the blank pages in the back were for his own numbers. He held it for a moment, as if he was not sure he had heard her correctly. Then he said thank you in the particular way young people say it when something has been given that they do not have a word for. The dog that had followed Vera through every calving season since 2003, a blue heeler named Patch, who was going gray at the muzzle and slow on the stairs but still made the gate every morning, lay on the porch that evening in the long gold light of a Nebraska October. Vera sat in the chair Roy had put on that porch in 1978 and looked at the east quarter and the Stover ground beyond it, 1,280 acres now, all of it either rested or rotating, the native grass in the creek bottom already greening from the September rains, in a way the upland ground would not match until November. There are 2 ways of knowing a piece of ground. The first way is fast and confident and built to travel. It arrives in a truck with a folder and a model and a projection, and it is right about most things at the scale of most years. And it is wrong about the one thing that matters at the scale of decades, which is what the ground is actually becoming under the management it is being given. The second way is slow and stays. It watches the same fence post through 40 seasons. It writes down the rainfall every week in a cracked leather book. It sees that the east quarter is greener than the west in a dry August and asks why, and it keeps asking why until it knows, and it passes that knowing forward in the only form that survives. A record kept in hand in the language of whoever will read it next. Roy Hargrove knew that. Vera Hargrove knew it. Denny Vogel was beginning to know it. What is rigid breaks in a drought. What has been rooting since 1927 does not. Patch lifted his head once in the last of the light, looked out at the east quarter where a small group of cows was drifting along the fence line toward water, and put his chin back down on his paws. The grass there was good. It had always been good for anyone who stayed long enough to read it.